We have a couple of political pros on hand with us today. One is one of the most sought-after Republican political consultants in the country. Also happens to be a Marine veteran, the one and only Bill Cortese. How are you doing, Bill?
Good, Frank. Good to see you.
And on the left, we have a Democratic political district leader in New York, the bluest city in the bluest state in the country. And he's also a candidate for city council in New York City, Josh Kravitz. We'll check in with Josh in just a minute. Bill, let me begin with you. Tell me your take on this Supreme Court decision that came out yesterday. The one that's gotten the most attention is this 6-3 decision in which Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Gorsuch sided with the liberals on the court to make sure that employers couldn't fire LGBTQ workers just because they were LGBT or Q. What's your reaction on both the merits of what the court did and on the politics of it?
Well, listen, I think there are a lot of us, I think certainly under probably the age of 40, of those of us on the right side of the political spectrum that support marriage equality. And we think that this is something that really just fortifies what a lot of us already believe. I think there are those a little further on the right that are upset about any of these types of anti-discrimination rulings that come down. But I think generally, I think it's a lot of things that people just, I think a lot of people assumed were already there. You can't discriminate on your race, on your religion, and now sexual orientation is one of them. You're not going to be able to discriminate based on who you love or who you're married to. So I don't. It's surprising coming from Gorsuch. Roberts we've seen has been a swing vote for quite some time now, but Gorsuch getting on here was interesting. And this is a conservative court. This is still a conservative court. And so I think that's where you see it just reflects, I think, where a lot of the country, even those on the right, have moved on an issue like same-sex marriage and LGBT rights. But politically, I think, I don't think it's going to move a lot anyway. I think people are kind of set in their ways, whether they support this or not. I don't think it has any real play on 2020 necessarily. Maybe it fires up a little more a few more conservatives on the right, but I think those people were already showing up and voting for President Trump and Republicans as it was.
But Justice Kavanaugh pointed out in his dissent that what they're doing here is essentially ascribing new meaning to the Civil Rights Act, which the people that wrote it clearly didn't mean. They could have, when Congress wrote the Civil Rights Act, provided for same-sex protections and transgender protections. They chose not to. We here in New York and 24 other states around the country, we have passed state versions preventing being fired for discrimination or sexual orientation. Why should the court get to rewrite what Congress wrote?
I think that's a matter of I think philosophy, obviously, of what the court's role truly is. Time and time again, we've seen that the Supreme Court has stepped in certain circumstances and essentially dictated what they felt was law. And I think some people would say that that's more of an activist court, but we've seen judicial activism not only on the left now, as I think a lot of conservatives have always described, but we see it coming from more conservative justices as well. And I think that's a matter of philosophy.
Let me bring in Josh here. Josh, it is funny. We always hear about judicial activism, usually from whichever side loses a Supreme Court decision. They point to the other side and say, you see, judicial activism. It's basically, to me, judicial activism is judges making decisions that you don't like. What was your reaction to the court's decision yesterday in this case where Gorsuch and Roberts sided with the liberals on the court?
Well, I mean, I would just start by saying, instead of calling it judicial activism, I think we should properly call it judicial review, because that's what it is, because it goes all the way back to Marbury versus Madison and John Marshall. And that's the very basic premise, that the Supreme Court can do statutory interpretation. This is statutory interpretation. This isn't constitutional law, but it's statutory interpretation, and it's well within the ambit of what the Supreme Court does. And then just from a substantive perspective, I think the idea that we can discriminate against people on the basis of their sexual orientation or the fact that they're transgendered is un-American. It's un-American that we can legally discriminate against people on the basis of their sexual orientation. And so this is just making a right something that should have been this way a long time. And I don't think it should be left up to state law, because at the end of the day, it still comes back to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And the idea of the 1964 Civil Rights Act is that people should not be discriminated against on the basis of immutable characteristics that they're born with. If you're born with dark colored skin or you're born gay, you should not be discriminated against in this country. That's the essence of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and so that's what the Supreme Court found.
All right, Josh, let me begin with you here. The president just did this event where he signed this executive order on police reform and police brutality. He's calling for banning chokeholds. We've seen some Republican and Democratic support within Washington for some sort of national police reform legislation. Are you at all optimistic in light of what we've seen in terms of these protests and the flagrant police misconduct that we saw in the George Floyd case, that we could see on policing the same thing that we saw on criminal justice reform, which is a broad bipartisan consensus to fix policing in this country?
I think that the problems are so deeply entrenched with a structurally racist system that, not just in the police systems, but just across the United States, and the way that we treat Black people in America, and the way we think about Black people in America, that Black men walking down the street have this presumption of guilt and this presumption of criminality very often, and particularly by the police, that there's no one piece of legislation or one piece of reform that will be able to solve that in just by virtue of the fact that it's a good bill. Now, am I happy that some of the provisions are in the bill? Yeah, of course. I think that those are all positive steps. But we need to look really deeply in ourselves. I mean, this time that we're living in with coronavirus and with all this change happening, it is a time we're all feeling pain that this is happening. And it's a time for us to look within and see particularly the pain that Black people in America face, and try and reform in deeper ways than just putting body cams.
Let me bring in Bill here.
Banning chokeholds.
Let me bring in Bill here in the final few minutes that we have, Josh.
Decades.
Bill, we saw New York, violent crime is up, murder is up, assault is up. In Chicago, May 30th, they had their deadliest day in 60 years. It certainly seems as if things are getting worse crime-wise, but it also seems in cities like New York, where they've just done away with the plainclothes anti-crime unit, and in cities like Minneapolis, where they've actually just voted to disband their police department, that it doesn't seem that these cities are taking the steps that I would be taking in terms of addressing a growing threat to violent crime. How do we continue to improve policing so that we don't see instances like what happened to George Floyd, but at the same time make sure that we don't see violent crime rising as it is in places like Chicago and New York?
Listen, I think that's a big challenge that we're facing right now in these big cities, is that you have, I think, governing bodies that want to disband the police and defund the police. And but who is there to maintain, as we've seen in places like Seattle, who's there to maintain, law and order? And I think, a lot of this, when you look at New York, comes back to failed leadership by Bill de Blasio, someone who didn't open up any lines of communication, who never really wanted to manage the city. He liked being mayor, but never wanted to deal with any of the responsibilities that come with it, and that is any sort of reform that he's over the past 7 years that he's been mayor. He's failed on that, and I think some of these big city mayors, it's coming back to bite them now, because they've failed to, over this time prior to everything happening here, have really failed to be proactive in taking any proactive steps in reforming their own police departments. And so clearly there needs to be change. I think if anybody over the past 3 weeks, 2 weeks can agree on that, is that there needs to be change in how we police. But defunding the police not only is bad policy, but it's going to be bad politics in 2020 as well. And I don't think all the numbers have shown that it's sour amongst most voters across the country. I think 2/3 oppose defunding the police. And I think when Democrats start to run with that sort of banner, and that becomes defunding the police versus Trump and the Republicans, it's a pretty clear and contrasting choice that people are going to have to make, and I don't think they're going to be picking.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. We'll have you both back next week. Always an enlightening discussion whenever you get Bill Cortese and Josh Kravitz together. They're two of my favorites, and if you keep watching, I can assure you they'll be two of yours. Coming up next, John Tobacco and I will take you behind the headlines to give you some insight into some news stories you might have seen, but you may not have understood. You're watching Liquid Lunch on Biz TV. I'm Frank Morano.